In the summer of 1962, a man with accumulated conviction stood in the narrow corridor of EMI Studios on Abbey Road and delivered a verdict that should have ended a career before it began. His name was George Martin. He was 36 years old. He had produced comedy records for Peter Sellers and Spike Milligan. He understood tempo, precision, and the mathematics of commercial appeal. He had been inside recording studios for over a decade, watching young men with guitars arrive full of hope and leave with nothing but the memory of their own inadequacy. He looked at the four young men from Liverpool standing before him with the particular expression of someone who has seen this exact scenario dozens of times before. Three of them he could work with. The fourth, a man named Pete Best, their drummer for 2 years, the one the girls screamed for, the handsome one with the distant movie star bearing, would have to go. Martin's assessment was clinical. The drumming lacked the crispness required for recording. It was fine for basement clubs in Hamburg, adequate for the cavern's sweat-thick darkness, but this was EMI. This was where you either met the standard or you disappeared into the vast graveyard of forgotten acts who thought passion could substitute for precision. 2 hours before their first major showcase, Brian Epstein, their manager, delivered the news to Pete Best in a small office above a record store. There would be no appeal. There would be no second chance. A replacement had already been found, a session drummer with a sharp face and a sharper sense of rhythm named Ringo Starr. What happened next was not an argument. It was not a plea. What Pete Best did in response to this humiliation would not become clear for years, but when it did, it would rewrite the assumed narrative of who made the Beatles possible and what genius actually looks like when it refuses to wait for permission. The Cavern Club in Liverpool was not romantic. It was a converted fruit warehouse beneath Matthew Street, accessible only by 18 narrow stone steps that descended into near-total darkness. The ceiling was composed of 3 brick arches that trapped cigarette smoke and human heat into a single suffocating atmosphere. By midnight, condensation would run down the walls in visible streams. The temperature regularly exceeded 90 degrees. There was one bathroom. The stage was barely elevated, more of a suggestion than a platform. This was where Pete Best had spent 2 years, 5 nights a week, sometimes 6, playing 8-hour sets that blurred into a single continuous performance. His hands developed calluses on top of calluses. His right foot, which drove the bass drum through hundreds of covers of What I Say and Roll Over Beethoven, acquired an unconscious stamina that allowed him to maintain a driving rhythm for 45 minutes without variation. He was 21 years old. He had joined the Beatles in August 1960, just before they left for Hamburg, replacing an inadequate drummer whose name no one remembers. He was not a trained musician. He had no formal education in tempo or dynamics. What he possessed was something the others needed desperately: absolute reliability. While John Lennon postured and Paul McCartney charmed and George Harrison perfected his guitar lines in near silence, Pete Best simply kept time. The girls noticed him first. He did not engage with the audience. He did not smile or wink or play to the cameras that occasionally appeared. He sat behind his kit with an expression of total concentration, his dark hair falling across his forehead, his jaw set, his entire body devoted to a single purpose. There was something hypnotic about his refusal to perform anything except the music itself. While the others seemed desperate for approval, Pete Best seemed indifferent to everything but the beat. By 1962, the Beatles were the most popular band in Liverpool. They had a residency at the Cavern. They had a manager in Brian Epstein, a well-dressed man from a prosperous family who saw in them something worth refining. They had an audition at EMI, the most important recording label in Britain. Everything was moving in the correct direction. And then George Martin heard Pete Best play. Norman Smith was 29 years old, a recording engineer at Abbey Road who had worked under George Martin for 3 years. He had learned to read Martin's expressions the way a sailor reads weather, small shifts in posture or tone that indicated whether a session would proceed smoothly or descend into tedious repetition. On the morning of June 6, 1962, Norman set up microphones in Studio 2 for a band from Liverpool called the Beatles. He had heard they were popular in the North, but the North was full of guitar bands who thought volume could substitute for composition. He arranged the drums in the standard configuration, placed the amplifiers at the usual distance, and waited. When the Beatles entered, Norman noticed the drummer immediately. Pete Best moved with a strange formality, not unfriendly but separate, as though he existed inside a different time frame than the others. While Lennon and McCartney joked with Martin and Harrison quietly tuned his guitar, Best simply sat at the kit and adjusted the height of his snare with the focused attention of someone preparing for surgery. They began with Love Me Do. It was a simple song, almost primitively so, 3 chords, a basic structure, a harmonica line that gave it a faint melancholy. Norman watched through the control room glass as Best counted them in. The drums were loud. That was Norman's first observation. Not loud in the sense of excessive volume, but loud in their presence. Each hit arrived with a physical weight that seemed to push against the other instruments rather than support them. The tempo was steady, mechanically so, but there was no variation, no response to the natural dynamics of the vocal line. When McCartney's voice rose slightly on the chorus, the drums remained exactly where they had been. When Lennon's harmonica entered, the rhythm did not shift to accommodate it. George Martin's face did not change expression, but Norman saw his hand move almost imperceptibly toward the talkback button, then pause, then withdraw. They finished the song. Martin asked them to play it again. They did. The drums were exactly the same, precise, unwavering, and fundamentally incompatible with the needs of a recording session. Norman felt what he would later describe as an internal sigh, the recognition that this session would require diplomatic conversation and eventual replacement. He had seen this scenario before. The drummer would be thanked, told he was very good but not quite right for this particular project, and a session player would be brought in to replay the parts with the necessary subtlety. What Norman did not know, what no one in that room could have predicted, was that Pete Best's removal would not end his contribution to the Beatles' sound. It would concentrate it. It would force him into a single choice that would reshape popular music more profoundly than any drum part he might have played on Love Me Do. But first, he would have to sit in a small office above NEMS Record Store and hear Brian Epstein explain, with as much gentleness as the situation allowed, that his services were no longer required. There are 2 accounts of how Pete Best responded to being fired. The first, repeated in most histories, suggests he was devastated, that he withdrew from music entirely, that he spent years bitterly watching his former bandmates ascend to unprecedented fame, while he worked as a civil servant and tried to forget he had ever held drumsticks. The second account is less known, but more consequential. 3 days after being dismissed, Pete Best did not go home. He did not call his mother, who ran the Casbah Coffee Club where the Beatles had once played regularly. He did not contact the music press to tell his side of the story. Instead, he walked into a small rehearsal space in Liverpool city centre where a group called Lee Curtis and the All-Stars were practicing. Lee Curtis was a local singer with modest ambitions and a need for a reliable drummer. Pete Best sat down at the kit without preamble, without explanation, and began to play. What emerged from that session was not the same drumming George Martin had rejected. The mechanical steadiness remained, but now it carried a different intention. Best had always played with precision, but precision in service of invisibility. He had tried to be the foundation that no one noticed. Now, freed from the obligation to support Lennon and McCartney's increasingly complex arrangements, he began to play with a productive tension, allowing the spaces between beats to carry as much weight as the beats themselves. The other musicians noticed immediately. Where before Pete Best's drumming had felt like a metronome, now it felt like a dare, Each measure established a framework so rigid that any deviation became amplified. Any fill or accent exploded with unexpected power. He had transformed his limitation into a method. Within 2 months, Lee Curtis and the All-Stars were generating the kind of crowd response that the Beatles had once commanded. Not because they were better musicians, but because their rhythm section had discovered something. That absolute control created the possibility for absolute release. Pete Best would lock into a pattern for 16 bars, 20, 32, refusing to vary by even a 16th note, until the tension became nearly unbearable, and then he would break it with a single fill that felt like structural collapse. This was not revenge. Revenge requires an audience. What Pete Best was doing was colder and more purposeful. He was conducting an experiment in the mechanics of excitement, and he was doing it with the quality of patience that belongs only to someone who has confused the map for the territory and is now, for the first time, seeing the actual landscape. He kept no journal. He gave no interviews about his method, but other drummers began to notice. Session players started asking the All-Stars bassist about their drummer's technique. A young Keith Moon attended one of their shows in 1963 and spent the entire performance standing directly in front of Best's kit, watching his footwork. The technique Pete Best developed in those months after his dismissal had a simple name, though no one called it that at the time: control and release. Establish absolute stability, then violate it at the precise moment the listener's nervous system cannot tolerate any more anticipation. It would become the foundational grammar of rock drumming for the next 3 decades. But its most immediate impact was on 4 young men recording their second single in a studio on Abbey Road. In September 1962, Ringo Starr entered EMI Studios as the Beatles' new drummer. He was technically proficient, more so than Pete Best. He could read charts. He understood dynamics. George Martin approved. They recorded Please Please Me on November 26, 1962. It was their second single, the one that would give them their first #1 hit, the one that would begin their transformation from regional phenomenon to national obsession. Norman Smith engineered the session. He noticed something immediately. Ringo's drumming was competent, responsive, exactly what Martin had wanted. But the song felt unstable in a way that Love Me Do had not. The verses moved with urgency, the pre-chorus built tension, but the release into the chorus felt earned rather than inevitable. It was good. It was not testimony. George Martin heard it too. After the third take, he stopped the session and spoke privately with Paul McCartney. The conversation lasted 7 minutes. When they returned, McCartney approached Ringo with a specific request. Could he hold the cymbal pattern through the entire verse without variation, not adding fills or responding to the vocal, just maintaining absolute consistency until the chorus arrived? Ringo looked confused. His instinct was to color the arrangement, to respond dynamically to the shifting energy of the vocal performance. What McCartney was asking him to do was mechanically simple but musically counterintuitive, to play like a machine for 16 bars so the human variation in the chorus would feel like liberation. Norman Smith, watching from the control room, recognized the technique immediately. It was what Pete Best had done naturally, what he had been criticized for, what had cost him his position in the band. Except now it was being deployed intentionally, as a compositional choice rather than a limitation. They recorded the take. The verse locked into a rigid pattern. The drums offered no variation, no relief. The tension built not through increasing complexity but through relentless sameness. And when the chorus arrived, Please Please Me, oh yeah, like I please you, the release was chemical. Norman felt it in his chest before he heard it in the speakers. George Martin, standing behind him, said 5 words, "There, that's your first #1. The song was built on a principle Pete Best had discovered alone, in a rehearsal room, playing with musicians who would never achieve fame. The technique had been transferred, refined, and deployed by players with greater skill and more sophisticated musical education. But its origin was in the hands of a man who had been judged inadequate and had responded not with argument but with total presence, sitting behind a drum kit and working out the mathematics of human anticipation through repetition and silence. Over the next 2 years, the Beatles would return to this technique again and again. "I Want to Hold Your Hand" used it. "She Loves You" depended on it. "A Hard Day's Night" weaponized it. The pattern was always the same. Establish absolute control, maintain it past the point of comfort, then break it with precision. Ringo Starr would become one of the most celebrated drummers in popular music. His instinct for when to add complexity and when to maintain simplicity would define the Beatles' sound. But the grammar he was using, the understanding that instability into tension could be created through excessive stability, had been written by someone else, in another room, for another purpose. Pete Best never spoke publicly about his contribution. He did not claim credit or seek acknowledgement. When asked about his time with the Beatles, he would say only that things had worked out as they should have, that the right people had ended up in the right places. But every drummer who learned to play "Please Please Me," every session musician who studied the space between Ringo's beats, every producer who understood that the most powerful release comes after the longest control, they were all, whether they knew it or not, students of a technique developed by a man who had been told he was not good enough, and who had responded by becoming essential in a way that did not require his presence. Norman Smith would go on to produce Pink Floyd's first albums. He would engineer some of the most important recordings of the 1960s. But in interviews conducted late in his life, he would return again and again to that moment in September 1962, watching Ringo Starr learn to play like Pete Best in order to make the Beatles sound like themselves. "We thought we knew what good drumming was," he said in a 1998 interview 3 years before his death. "Turns out we knew what we preferred. What we preferred wasn't what was needed." The distinction haunted him. For 30 years, he carried the memory of that first session with Pete Best, the internal sigh he had felt, the pity score he had assigned before the song had even finished. He had confused the map for the territory. He had believed that his accumulated experience had given him the ability to recognize excellence, when in fact it had only given him the ability to recognize familiarity. What Pete Best possessed was not technical skill. It was structural understanding. He knew, perhaps unconsciously, that music is not sound but the relationship between sound and silence, presence and absence, expectation and violation. The drumming George Martin had rejected was not wrong. It was unrefined. It needed context, intention, deployment at the precise moment when its rigidity would create rather than prevent feeling. The Beatles gave it that context. They took the limitation and made it a feature. They transformed Pete Best's mechanical steadiness into a compositional principle, and that principle became the rhythmic foundation of songs that would be studied and reproduced by millions of musicians across generations. This is not a story about justice. Pete Best did not receive equal recognition. He did not share in the wealth or fame. The narrative that persists is still the narrative of replacement, of the drummer who was not good enough, who was left behind while his former bandmates became the most famous musicians in human history. But there is another narrative, visible only if you know where to look, audible only if you understand what you are hearing. Every time a drummer holds a pattern past the point of comfort, they are using Pete Best's language. Every time a producer asks for less variation rather than more, they are applying Pete Best's insight. Every time a song builds tension not through complexity but through relentless simplicity, it is built on the foundation Pete Best discovered in the weeks after he was told he had failed. Genius doesn't wait for permission. It doesn't require acknowledgement or fame or even conscious recognition. It operates through influence, through technique, through the transfer of understanding from one musician to another, until the original source becomes invisible, absorbed into the common practice of an entire art form. Pete Best was fired from the Beatles 2 hours before a showcase. His replacement became one of the most beloved drummers in popular music. The songs they recorded together changed the world. But the rhythm they used, the grammar of control and release, of stability transformed into tension, of mechanical precision deployed at the exact moment it could create human feeling, that was written by someone else. By a man who sat in a rehearsal room in Liverpool and worked out, through repetition and total presence, the difference between what people knew and what they assumed. The lesson has taken decades to recognize. It is still being learned. That distinction between knowledge and assumption, between the map and the territory, between accumulated convictions and observed truth, is not just the story of Pete Best and the Beatles. It is the story of how we recognize genius only after it has already reshaped everything we thought we understood.